Hello, and welcome. Find a place where you can rest completely. Allow your body to feel heavy, supported, and safe. Let go of the day that has passed. Let go of the thoughts of tomorrow, and simply be here, now, in this quiet moment. Tonight, our journey will not be one of great battles or towering empires. Instead, we will follow a much smaller path, the path of a tiny, humble seed, a seed that held within it the power to awaken the world, and yet whose story is gentle enough to guide us into a state of deep relaxation. This is the story of coffee. But before it was a daily ritual, it was a secret whispered on the winds of the Ethiopian highlands, a secret held in the quiet devotion of desert mystics. So, breathe in slowly, and as you breathe out, let us travel back in time, back to the very beginning, to the land where the silence is deep and the history is long. Our story takes us to the ancient land known as Abyssinia, the land we now call Ethiopia. Imagine a place lifted high above the world, vast plateaus where the air is thin and cool, and the sun warms the rich red earth. This is a land of rolling hills, deep valleys, and a silence so profound it feels like the earth itself is dreaming. It is here, in the hazy past of the 9th century, that our story takes root. In these highlands, growing wild and unnoticed, was a particular kind of shrub. It had glossy, dark green leaves, and it produced berries that would ripen to a brilliant crimson red, like tiny jewels scattered amongst the foliage. For countless generations, these plants were just a part of the landscape, their secret energy unknown, their purpose unfulfilled. The wind would rustle their leaves, the rain would wash their berries, and time would simply pass them by. And it might have remained that way, were it not for a humble goat herder named Kaldi. Kaldi's days followed a simple, peaceful rhythm, a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of his flock. He would lead his goats from the village in the cool of the morning, guide them across the hillsides to graze, and watch over them as the sun made its slow, silent journey across the vast African sky. He knew each of his goats, the mischievous one who always strayed, the old one who walked slowly, the young ones full of boundless life. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, soft shadows across the valley, Kaldi noticed something was amiss. His flock, usually calm and placid at this hour, preparing to be led home, was behaving with a strange exuberance. They were dancing, leaping and bleating with an inexhaustible energy, butting their heads playfully in the air, their hooves seeming to barely touch the ground. Kaldi's eyes, filled with a gentle confusion, followed their gaze to the source of their excitement, a cluster of shrubs laden with those bright red berries. He watched as they nibbled eagerly on the fruit, their tails wagging with delight. Curiosity, quiet and patient, overcame him. He approached one of the bushes, his calloused fingers plucking a single ripe berry. He rolled it in his palm, feeling its smooth, firm skin. He placed it in his mouth. The pulp inside was subtly sweet, a taste of the wild earth. He chewed it thoughtfully, and then he felt it. It was not a jolt, not a sudden shock. It was a gentle wave of clarity washing over his mind. The fatigue from his long day, a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying, began to recede. His mind felt sharp, yet serene. The world around him seemed to come into a softer, clearer focus. The rough texture of the tree bark seemed more complex. The distant hum of insects became a symphony of individual sounds. The precise shade of the evening sky seemed deeper, more profound. He felt awake, more peacefully and completely awake than he had ever felt before. Filled with this quiet, wondrous energy, Kaldi gathered a pouch full of the berries. He believed he had stumbled upon something miraculous, a divine gift. He made his way to a nearby monastery, a place of stone and silence, hoping to share his discovery with the monks, men who devoted their lives to contemplation. The head abbot, a man whose face was lined with the maps of long years of prayer and discipline, listened to Kaldi's story. His expression was a mask of stern skepticism. He took the berries from Kaldi's hand, his fingers turning one over and over, examining it as if it were a dangerous jewel. Energy that did not come from rest, alertness that was not born of discipline. To a man who believed the body was a distraction to be subdued, this sounded like a temptation, a trick of the devil designed to lead his monks astray. In a gesture of pious rejection, a swift movement to banish the perceived evil, he seized the pouch of berries and cast them into the fire pit that glowed at the center of the room. "The devil's work belongs in the devil's fire," he declared, his voice echoing slightly against the cold stone walls. But then, something magical happened, an unintended alchemy. As the berries began to heat, the flesh scorching away, the seeds within them, the beans, began to roast. A soft hissing and a gentle crackling sound came from the fire, and with it, a scent began to rise and fill the ancient room. An aroma unlike any other the monks had ever known. It was rich, nutty, and deeply, profoundly comforting. It smelled of the earth, of toasted nuts, of a subtle, dark chocolate, and it carried a hint of something heavenly. The aroma was so captivating that it disarmed their fear and melted their skepticism. The monks' stern faces softened with curiosity. One of them carefully raked the now darkened, almost black beans from the embers. They were hard and brittle. Another monk, younger and more inquisitive, had an idea. He crushed the roasted beans between two stones into a coarse, dark powder, and then dissolved this powder in a jug of hot water. The liquid that resulted was dark, opaque, and intensely fragrant. Hesitantly, as if partaking in a forbidden ritual, the monks each took a sip from a communal cup. The taste was bitter, complex, and strange to their palates. But as the warm liquid settled within them, they felt the same gentle wave of clarity that Kaldi had described. That night, during their long hours of prayer, their minds did not wander into the fog of sleep. Their eyelids did not grow heavy. Their voices, chanting in the deep stillness of the monastery, remained steady and strong until the first light of dawn painted the windows. They had cast the devil's fruit into the fire, and an angel's aroma had emerged. They had found not a temptation, but a tool for devotion. The journey of coffee had begun, born from a goat herder's curiosity and a monk's misguided piety. For a time, the secret of this roasted bean remained within the highlands of Ethiopia, a local treasure. But secrets, like seeds, have a way of traveling, carried in the saddlebags of traders on the ancient incense routes, crossing the narrow blue expanse of the Red Sea. The beans finally arrived in Yemen, on the sun-drenched and mountainous Arabian Peninsula. It was here, in the 15th century, that coffee found its first true champions, the Sufi mystics. The Sufis were ascetics, poets, and scholars, dedicated to a deeply personal and mystical connection with God. Their spiritual practice often involved rituals of chanting and meditation called dhikr, which could last through the entire night. For them, sleep was a constant adversary, a veil that fell between them and their divine communion. When they discovered coffee, they embraced it as a sacred gift. They called it kahwa, an ancient Arabic word that once referred to wine. But this was not a wine for intoxication of the senses, but for the elevation of the soul. This was the wine of Araby, a beverage that sharpened the mind, banished fatigue, and allowed them to journey deeper into their spiritual practices. It became an integral part of their nightly rituals, a dark, warm brew that helped them push back the fog of sleep and maintain their focus on the divine. It was also in Yemen that coffee cultivation was transformed from happenstance to art. On the steep, terraced mountainsides that rose like grand stairways from the desert floor, farmers learned the patient craft of growing, harvesting, and processing the precious beans. The port city of Mocha became the singular gateway for coffee to the rest of the world. Its name became so intertwined with the drink that for centuries, Mocha simply meant coffee. The Arabs understood the immense value of what they had. They guarded their new treasure with fierce jealousy. To ensure no one else could grow the magical plant, they decreed that no fertile bean could leave the country. All beans destined for export were first boiled or partially roasted, rendering them incapable of germination. For centuries, they held a complete and total monopoly. The world did not yet know coffee, but it knew of Mocha, a distant, almost mythical port from which a mysterious, invigorating dark brew emerged. The secret was contained within the borders of Arabia, but such a powerful aroma cannot be contained by walls or ports forever. It began to drift northward, carried on the winds of trade and the footsteps of pilgrims, towards the bustling heart of the world's most powerful empire. And so, the secret of coffee, though fiercely guarded at its source in Yemen, could not be contained. Its aroma, potent and alluring, began to drift northward. It traveled not in grand armadas, but in the quiet, unassuming saddlebags of merchants and pilgrims. It followed the ancient caravan routes, paths worn into the desert sand by centuries of trade in spices, silks, and incense. Imagine these caravans, long lines of camels, moving like a slow, patient river across the vast, silent expanse of the desert. By night, they would rest under a blanket of brilliant stars, and by the flickering light of a campfire, a trader might share a small cup of the dark, bitter brew with a fellow traveler. The drink was a comfort against the cold desert night, a ward against the heavy hand of fatigue. The city of Mecca, the spiritual heart of the Islamic world, became a crucial nexus. Pilgrims from as far as Persia, Egypt, and Anatolia would gather here, and in the city's courtyards and meeting places, they encountered kahwa for the first time. They tasted its strange, invigorating power and heard the stories of its discovery. When they completed their pilgrimage and returned to their homelands, they carried with them not only spiritual renewal, but also the memory and the craving for this remarkable new drink. And so, coffee spread, not through conquest, but through conversation, not through force, but through faith and commerce. It flowed northward, into the great, ancient cities of the Levant, Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo. And from there, it made its way to the very center of the known world, the magnificent, sprawling city of Constantinople, the capital of the mighty Ottoman Empire. Constantinople, a city that straddled two continents, a crucible of cultures, power, and ideas. By the mid-16th century, this was the most important city on earth, and it was here that coffee would find its grandest stage yet. The first coffee house, or kava khane, opened its doors in Constantinople around the year 1554. It was a new concept, a new kind of social space, and its popularity spread like wildfire. Soon, hundreds of coffee houses dotted the city's labyrinthine streets, from the grand boulevards to the humblest alleyways. Let us step inside one. Push past the heavy wooden door and leave the noise of the street behind. The air inside is warm, thick with the rich aroma of roasting coffee, the sweet scent of tobacco from hookahs, and perhaps a hint of cardamom or cloves. The light is dim, filtering through stained glass windows or cast in soft pools by ornate lanterns. The room is not filled with tables and chairs, but with low divans and plush cushions scattered across intricately woven carpets. The sounds here are a gentle symphony. The soft murmur of conversation in a dozen different languages, the quiet clinking of small porcelain cups, the strategic, satisfying click of backgammon or chess pieces. And in a corner, a musician might be softly strumming an oud, its melancholic melody weaving through the room like another thread of smoke. These places were called schools of the wise, for they were far more than just places to drink a beverage. They were the city's living rooms, its newsrooms, and its intellectual heart. Men from all walks of life gathered here. A sea captain, fresh from the Mediterranean, might share news of distant ports. A poet could recite his latest work to a captivated audience. Merchants could negotiate deals, and political officials could discreetly gauge the mood of the public. Scholars could debate points of theology or science, their discussions fueled by the clear-headed energy the coffee provided. Here, social hierarchies seemed to melt away. For the price of a cup of coffee, a common man could sit and listen to the conversations of the city's most brilliant minds. Information, ideas, and gossip flowed more freely here than anywhere else in the empire. It was a new kind of institution, built not on power or piety, but on the simple, communal act of sharing a drink. And the drink itself was prepared with a ritualistic reverence. The process was a performance, a small act of culinary art. The green beans would often be roasted right there in the coffee house, in a shallow pan held over a brazier of hot coals. The room would fill with the crackling sound of the roasting beans and that initial, intoxicating aroma. Once they reached a deep, dark brown, they were allowed to cool slightly before being placed into a cylindrical brass mill. They were ground by hand into a powder as fine as flour. This powder, along with water and often a measure of sugar, was added to a small, long-handled copper pot called an ibrik or sezve. The pot was then placed directly into the hot sands of the brazier, which allowed for a gentle, even heating. The brewer would watch it intently. As the mixture heated, a dark foam would begin to rise. Just before it boiled over, he would lift it from the heat, let the foam settle, and then return it to the sand. He might do this 2 or 3 times, a patient dance with the heat, building a rich, thick crema. Finally, the coffee was poured, unfiltered, into small, handleless cups. The drinker would wait a moment for the fine grounds to settle at the bottom, creating a thick, muddy sediment. To drink a Turkish coffee is to drink the whole bean, its essence completely dissolved in water. The result was a brew that was strong, thick, and profoundly flavorful. It was meant to be sipped slowly, its potent character savored over the course of a long conversation. But not everyone was pleased with the rise of the coffee house. The very things that made them popular, the free exchange of ideas and the mixing of social classes, also made them dangerous in the eyes of the authorities. Conservative imams and clerics began to preach against the drink. They argued that anything roasted to the point of being charred was technically forbidden, like charcoal. Others declared it to be an intoxicant, no different from the forbidden wine, creating a false energy and leading to idle behavior. They saw these coffee houses as dens of vice, where men would waste their days in frivolous talk instead of attending to their prayers and their work. The Sultan and his advisors had a more worldly concern. The coffee houses were becoming hotbeds of political dissent. In the dimly lit corners, over cups of the dark brew, men would complain about taxes, critique the Sultan's latest decree, or gossip about intrigues within the palace walls. Plots were hatched, and rebellions were whispered into existence. The Sultan's spies reported that these schools of the wise were breeding grounds for sedition, and so the backlash came. At various times, religious edicts were issued, and the Sultan Murad IV, in the 17th century, went so far as to order the closure of all coffee houses in Constantinople. He reportedly roamed the streets in disguise at night, and any citizen he caught drinking coffee would face the severest of punishments. But the love for coffee and for the community of the coffee house had already taken too deep a root in the city's culture. The bans were impossible to enforce. People simply moved their coffee brewing into their homes or to secret back rooms. The demand was too great. In the end, the authorities always had to relent. The coffee houses would reopen, the aroma would once again drift onto the streets, and the gentle murmur of conversation would resume. Coffee was no longer just a drink. It had become an inseparable part of the social and political fabric of the most powerful empire on earth. It had proven that it was a force more resilient than the will of a sultan, and as it cemented its place in Ottoman life, new eyes were beginning to watch this curious ritual with great interest. The eyes of Venetian merchants and European travelers, who saw in this dark, bitter brew not a threat, but an opportunity. These were the eyes of Venetian merchants, men whose fortunes were built on the trade between East and West. For them, Constantinople was not just a city of wonders, but a city of opportunities. In the bustling bazaars and the quiet coffee houses, they saw a new commodity, a new curiosity to bring back to the canals and palazzos of their opulent home. At first, coffee trickled into Europe not as a beverage for pleasure, but as a medicinal curiosity. It was sold in small quantities by apothecaries, alongside rare spices and exotic herbs. Doctors prescribed it for a variety of ailments, praising its ability to aid digestion and lift the spirits from melancholy. It was expensive, mysterious, and rare, a luxury item for the wealthy elite who had a taste for the exotic. They would drink it from tiny, precious cups, more as a statement of worldliness than as a daily habit, but the stories that came with the beans were as intoxicating as the drink itself. Tales of the grand coffee houses of the Ottoman Empire, of the schools of the wise, where men would debate and dream for hours, fueled by this strange black brew. The idea of a drink that could stimulate the mind without clouding it with alcohol was a radical concept in a Europe dominated by wine and beer. It was an idea that held a powerful, almost subversive allure. But as the popularity of this Eastern novelty began to grow, so too did suspicion. In the deeply religious climate of 17th century Europe, anything that came from the Ottoman Empire, the lands of the infidel, was viewed with deep mistrust, and this drink was particularly suspect. It was black as tar, a color associated with damnation. It was bitter, a taste not commonly sought after, and its effect was strange and unnatural, creating an energy that seemed to come from nowhere. Conservative voices began to rise against it. They warned that this was a diabolical concoction, a bitter invention of Satan. They argued that it was a ploy by the Muslims to corrupt and weaken Christendom. They saw the coffee houses of Constantinople not as centers of learning, but as places of idleness and sedition, and they feared these institutions would take root in their own cities. In Venice, advisors petitioned the local clergy to condemn the drink. The pressure grew, and the fate of coffee in Europe seemed to hang in the balance. The matter eventually reached the highest authority of the Catholic world, the Vatican, and Pope Clement VIII. His advisors implored him to forbid this Muslim drink once and for all, to protect the souls of his flock from its nefarious influence. Pope Clement, a man known for his thoughtful nature, decided he could not condemn something he had never experienced himself. He requested that a cup of this controversial beverage be brought before him. Imagine the scene. In a grand, silent chamber of the Vatican, decorated with frescoes and heavy tapestries, the Pope's advisors watched with bated breath. A steaming cup of coffee, prepared in the Ottoman style, was presented to him. The rich, unfamiliar aroma filled the air, a scent of a distant world. The Pope lifted the small cup. He observed its dark, mysterious color. He inhaled its fragrance. Then he took a slow, deliberate sip. The advisors leaned in, expecting a grimace of disgust, a declaration of condemnation, but instead, a look of pleasant surprise appeared on the Pope's face. He took another sip, savoring the complex, robust flavor. After a moment of quiet contemplation, he looked at his anxious advisors and is said to have declared, "Why, this devil's drink is so delicious. We should cheat the devil by baptizing it." And with that single, decisive act, the religious opposition to coffee crumbled. By giving the drink his papal blessing, Pope Clement effectively Christianized it, stripping it of its infidel associations and opening the door for its acceptance across the Catholic world. The bitter invention of Satan had been welcomed into the fold. The path was now clear for the coffeehouse to be born in Europe. While Venice may have opened the first European coffeehouse around 1645, it was in another rising maritime power that the institution truly flourished. England. The first English coffeehouse opened in Oxford in 1650, quickly becoming a favorite haunt for the university's students and scholars. But it was in London, the chaotic, burgeoning heart of a new global empire, that coffee culture exploded. By the turn of the 18th century, there were hundreds, perhaps thousands, of coffee houses in London alone. These were not like the opulent, relaxed coffee houses of the East. London coffee houses were often boisterous, smoke-filled, and intensely democratic spaces. They became known as penny universities. The name was literal. For the price of a single penny, which bought you a dish of coffee, any man, regardless of his station, could enter and have a seat, and in doing so, he gained access to the greatest minds and the latest news of the day. Each coffee house catered to a specific clientele. In one, you might find merchants and ship captains gathered around a table, sketching maps and founding what would eventually become the insurance market, Lloyd's of London. In another, scientists like Isaac, Newton, and Robert Hooke would meet to debate theories and lay the groundwork for the Royal Society. In yet another, writers like Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope would trade witty insults and discuss their latest pamphlets. These were the engines of the Age of Enlightenment. Unlike taverns, where alcohol clouded judgment, coffee houses were places of sober and serious debate. They fueled a new kind of public discourse. Newspapers, then a new invention, were made available for all to read. Ideas about politics, finance, science, and philosophy were exchanged, debated, and refined. A man's argument mattered more than his title. The coffeehouse became the crucible of modernity, a place where the very idea of public opinion was forged, and all of it was powered by this dark, stimulating, and now thoroughly European drink. The continent had not only accepted coffee, it had made it its own, transforming it into the fuel for a new age of reason and commerce. But as Europe's appetite for coffee grew insatiable, a pressing problem emerged. The supply, the source of the bean itself, was still firmly in the hands of their rivals. This imbalance of power could not last. A desire was growing, a desire that would soon launch fleets of ships across vast oceans, all in pursuit of the precious plant itself. This insatiable European appetite for coffee, an appetite sharpened in the bustling penny universities and refined in the elegant salons of Paris, created a profound economic imbalance. Europe was consuming vast quantities of the bean, but it produced none. Every single sack of coffee arrived in the ports of Amsterdam, London, and Marseille on ships that had sailed from the Levant after a long and costly journey. The source remained stubbornly singular: the mountainous highlands of Yemen, guarded by the port of Mocha. The Ottoman and Arab merchants held what is known as a gilded cage. They were happy to sell the roasted beans to the Europeans, reaping enormous profits, but they maintained their centuries-old policy with absolute rigidity. No fertile seed, and certainly no living plant, was ever permitted to leave their lands. Any bean destined for export was first boiled or parched, a simple act of sterilization that ensured their global monopoly remained absolute. For the rising colonial powers of Europe, the Dutch, the French, and the British, this was an intolerable situation. Their entire economic philosophy was built on the idea of controlling both the supply and the demand. To be so utterly dependent on a rival power for a commodity that was fast becoming a daily necessity was not just a commercial inconvenience. It was a strategic vulnerability the race was on. It was a quiet, undeclared race, fought not with cannons and warships, but with spies, smugglers, and botanists. The goal was singular and monumental: to break the Arabian monopoly, to steal the living coffee plant, and to transplant it into their own colonial territories, creating a new coffee empire that they alone would control. The first to make a serious attempt were the Dutch, masters of global trade and pioneers of corporate espionage through their powerful Dutch East India Company. Their network of agents and traders stretched across the globe, and they were patient and methodical. Their initial efforts were focused on the Malabar coast of India. Around the year 1670, a Sufi pilgrim from India named Baba Budan was on his Hajj to Mecca. The stories differ in the details, but the legend holds that he was so enchanted by the coffee he drank in Yemen that he was determined to bring it home. Knowing that he could not take fertile beans through the port of Mocha, he reportedly strapped 7 raw coffee beans to his stomach, hidden beneath his robes. 7 was a sacred number, and he considered his mission a holy one. He managed to evade the Arab guards and successfully smuggle the beans back to the hills of Chikmagalur in southern India. There, he planted them, and they grew. This single daring act established the first coffee plantation outside of Africa and Arabia. While it was not yet a European success, it proved one crucial thing: the monopoly could be broken. Inspired by this breach, the Dutch intensified their own efforts. Around the end of the 17th century, a Dutch commander named Adrian van Omen, operating out of the port of Mocha, finally succeeded where so many others had failed. The exact method remains a mystery. It could have been bribery, theft, or simply finding a lax guard, but he managed to secure a handful of living coffee seedlings. He did not send them directly to Holland. The journey was too long, the climate too different. Instead, he transported them to the Dutch colonial territory of Java, in modern-day Indonesia. The island's rich volcanic soil and humid tropical climate proved to be the perfect new home for the Ethiopian plant. The seedlings thrived. By the early 1700s, the Dutch had established vast, successful coffee plantations. The first Javanese coffee reached Amsterdam in 1706, causing a sensation. The Arabian monopoly was not just broken, it was shattered. The Dutch had created a new center of coffee production in the East Indies, and the name Java would soon become another word for coffee itself. The success of the Dutch did not go unnoticed. In Paris, the court of King Louis XIV, the Sun King, watched with envy. France was a major consumer of coffee, and the king was not content to buy it from his Dutch rivals. He wanted a source of his own. The Dutch, now guarding their new prize as jealously as the Arabs once had, were reluctant to share. But diplomacy, especially in the courts of 18th century Europe, was a complex game of gifts and favors. In 1714, the mayor of Amsterdam presented King Louis XIV with a special gift, a single, healthy, 5-foot-tall coffee tree. This was no ordinary plant. It was a symbol of Dutch success and a gesture of goodwill. The king was delighted. He ordered the construction of a magnificent greenhouse, the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, specifically to house this precious specimen. The tree was planted in a special pot, cared for by the king's own royal botanist. It was protected from the harsh European winters by a state-of-the-art heating system. This single tree, nicknamed the Noble Tree, became a celebrated curiosity. Aristocrats and visiting dignitaries would be taken to see it, to marvel at this exotic plant that produced the beans for their favorite morning drink. It grew strong and even produced a small harvest of cherries, which were cultivated with immense care. For years, it was a living trophy, a symbol of royal prestige. But its true destiny lay not in a Parisian greenhouse, but across the vast blue expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. That destiny would be fulfilled by a young, determined French naval officer named Gabriel Mathieu de Clieu. He was stationed in Martinique, a French colony in the Caribbean. He saw the island's fertile soil and warm climate, and became obsessed with the idea that it could be the perfect place to cultivate coffee, creating a French coffee empire to rival the Dutch in Java. All he needed was a plant. On a leave of absence in Paris, de Clieu petitioned the king for a seedling from the Noble Tree. His request was initially denied. The king's botanist was fiercely protective of his charge and did not want to risk a part of it on a dangerous sea voyage, but de Clieu was relentless. Using his courtly connections and his unwavering persistence, he eventually, and some stories say unofficially, secured a precious seedling, perhaps just a small branch, taken from the main tree. He protected his charge with incredible devotion. He had a small glass case constructed to house the seedling on the ship's deck, allowing it to receive sunlight while being shielded from the salty sea spray. The journey back to Martinique was an epic odyssey, a series of trials that seemed to test his resolve at every turn. The ship was attacked by Barbary pirates off the coast of Africa, and during the fierce battle, Declieux had to protect his fragile plant from cannon fire and chaos. Then, the ship was caught in a violent storm, tossed about by monstrous waves. Declieux lashed himself and his glass case to the deck to prevent them from being washed overboard. When the storm passed, a period of dead calm followed, leaving the ship stranded for days under a scorching sun. Fresh water became severely rationed. As the crew suffered from thirst, Declieux shared his own meager daily ration of water with his tiny plant, moistening the soil with a damp cloth to keep it alive. One account even tells of a jealous fellow passenger, envious of the attention the plant received, who tried to sabotage it, tearing off a branch in a struggle with Declieux. But both the officer and the seedling endured. When the ship finally limped into the port of Martinique, the plant was weak, having lost some branches, but it was alive. Declieux planted it with great care on his estate, surrounding it with a thorn hedge and stationing guards to protect it. The seedling not only survived, it flourished in the Caribbean soil. It grew into a healthy tree and produced its first harvest. From that harvest, Declieux distributed seeds to other planters on the island. The results were astonishing. Within 50 years, coffee plantations had spread from Martinique to the neighboring islands of Haiti, Santo Domingo, and Guadeloupe. That single, fragile seedling, carried across the ocean by the sheer force of one man's will, became the parent of countless millions of coffee trees. It was the genesis of the entire coffee industry in Central and South America. The race to cultivate a global empire had a new, powerful victor, and the stage was now set for coffee to transform from a luxury good into a global commodity, a transformation that would be built on the rich soil of the New World, but also on a dark and troubling foundation. And so, from that single, tenacious seedling carried by Gabriel Declieux, an agricultural explosion erupted across the New World. The Caribbean islands, with their volcanic soil and year-round warmth, proved to be a paradise for coffee cultivation. The French colony of Saint-Domingue, now modern-day Haiti, became the jewel in the crown. By the late 1780s, this one small colony was producing nearly half of all the coffee consumed in the entire world. The elegant coffee houses of Paris, the bustling exchanges of London, and the comfortable parlors of Amsterdam were flooded with this new, affordable, and plentiful supply of coffee. The price dropped, and what was once a luxury for the elite became an accessible daily ritual for the burgeoning middle class. Coffee fueled the clerks, the thinkers, the merchants, and the early factory workers of the Industrial Revolution. This surge in consumption was seen as a triumph of European commerce and ingenuity. But this triumph was built upon a foundation of profound human suffering. The beauty of the verdant coffee landscapes masked a brutal reality: the intense, back-breaking labor required to clear the land, plant the trees, and harvest the delicate coffee cherries by hand was immense. To meet the insatiable demand from Europe, the French and other colonial powers turned to the transatlantic slave trade on an industrial scale. Millions of enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to these islands, enduring the horrific Middle Passage, only to be sold into a life of brutal, unpaid labor on the coffee and sugar plantations. Their lives were short and filled with hardship. They worked from sunup to sundown in the blistering heat, under the constant threat of the overseer's whip. The very energy that coffee gave to the thinkers and innovators of the Enlightenment in Europe was extracted directly from the stolen energy and stolen lives of enslaved people in the colonies. This dark paradox lies at the heart of coffee's history in the 18th century. The drink that had become synonymous with intellectual freedom, rational debate, and social discourse in the coffee houses of Europe was produced by a system that represented the complete antithesis of those values, the complete and violent subjugation of human beings. The bitter taste in the cup, had anyone in Europe cared to notice, was not just from the bean itself. A system built on such profound injustice is inherently unstable. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity that were debated over coffee in Parisian cafes eventually echoed across the Atlantic, reaching the very people who were enslaved to produce it. In 1791, inspired by the French Revolution, the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue rose up in a massive revolt. It was a long, brutal, and complex conflict, but it would become the only successful slave rebellion in human history, leading to the establishment of the independent nation of Haiti in 1804. The Haitian Revolution had a seismic impact on the world, but its effect on the coffee industry was immediate and catastrophic. The world's largest and most efficient producer of coffee was suddenly crippled. Plantations were burned, the colonial system was overthrown, and production plummeted. The coffee houses of Europe felt the shockwave. Prices soared. Supply became scarce. The collapse of the Haitian coffee industry created a massive void in the global market, and it was a void that another, much larger, nation was perfectly positioned to fill. The center of the coffee universe was about to shift southward to a vast and sprawling land of immense potential, Brazil. Brazil, a Portuguese colony, had been watching the success of its French and Dutch neighbors with great interest. They were desperate to get their hands on the coffee plant, but the French in neighboring Guyana guarded their plantations as fiercely as the Arabs once had in Yemen. Crossing the border to steal a plant was a perilous undertaking. Brazil needed a more subtle approach. Their opportunity came around 1727 when a border dispute arose between French and Dutch Guiana. Brazil was asked to send a mediator to help resolve the conflict. They chose a man perfectly suited for a mission of espionage and diplomacy, Sergeant Major Francisco de Melo Palheta. Palheta was known for his charm, intelligence, and suave demeanor. He arrived in French Guiana not as a soldier, but as a distinguished diplomat. He successfully mediated the border dispute, earning the trust and gratitude of the French governor. During his stay, he made no secret of his admiration for the governor's coffee plantations, but his polite requests for a few souvenir seedlings were always, just as politely, refused. Palheta realized that a direct approach would fail. He needed a different strategy, one that targeted not the governor's sense of duty, but perhaps his wife's sense of affection. The historical details are romanticized, but the legend is a cornerstone of Brazilian history. Palheta charmed the governor's wife, becoming a favored guest and a captivating conversationalist. As his diplomatic mission concluded, the governor held a state banquet in his honor. At the end of the evening, as a public gesture of farewell, the governor's wife presented Sergeant Palheta with a large bouquet of flowers. It was a beautiful, but seemingly ordinary, parting gift. But hidden deep within the vibrant blossoms and lush leaves were the treasures Palheta had been seeking all along. A handful of freshly cut coffee cherry cuttings, their beans still fertile and ready to be planted. The mission was a success. Palheta returned to Brazil a hero, not for the treaty he had negotiated, but for the bouquet he carried. He planted the seeds in his home state of Pará, and just as they had in the Caribbean, they flourished. The initial growth of coffee in Brazil was slow, but in the early 19th century, after the collapse of Haiti's production, and as Brazil moved towards independence from Portugal, everything changed. The country's vast expanses of land, its rich terra roxa, or red earth, and its favorable climate, particularly in the provinces of Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, proved to be the most perfect environment for coffee cultivation the world had ever seen. Vast swaths of the Atlantic rainforest were cleared to make way for a sea of coffee trees. A new class of powerful landowners, the coffee barons, emerged. They built magnificent plantation houses, called fazendas, and wielded immense political and economic power. Their wealth was built on a single crop, and their entire system, like the one in the Caribbean before it, was dependent on slave labor. For decades, Brazil became one of the largest importers of enslaved Africans in the world, long after many other nations had abolished the trade. By the mid-1800s, Brazil's dominance was absolute. It was no longer just a major producer. It was a coffee titan, a colossus that dwarfed all other nations. At its peak, Brazil would produce a staggering percentage of the world's coffee, sometimes over 80%. The sheer volume of Brazilian coffee flooded the global market, making the drink cheaper and more accessible than ever before. The morning cup of coffee for a factory worker in Manchester or a clerk in New York was now almost certainly made from beans grown on the sprawling fazendas of Brazil. The nation's infrastructure, its first railways, the modernization of its ports, was built to serve the coffee trade, to move the beans from the vast inland plantations to the ships waiting to carry them to the rest of the world. Coffee had built a new nation, shaping its economy, its politics, and its society. But as the 19th century wore on, the moral contradictions at the heart of this empire were becoming impossible to ignore. The world was changing, the calls for abolition were growing louder, and the coffee titan of Brazil would soon face a profound and painful transformation of its own. Brazil's colossal coffee empire, for all its economic might, was built on a moral fault line that could not hold. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, pressure mounted both from within and from outside the country to end the institution of slavery. The British Empire, once a major participant in the slave trade, now used its powerful navy to blockade slave ships. Abolitionist movements grew stronger within Brazil itself. The coffee barons, fearing the collapse of their labor system, resisted fiercely. But the tide of history was irreversible. In 1888, Brazil became the last nation in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery, with the signing of the Lei Áurea, or the Golden Law. The transition was tumultuous. The newly freed people, given no land, no education, and no support, faced immense hardship. The plantation owners, in turn, faced a severe labor crisis. To fill the void, the Brazilian government launched massive campaigns to attract immigrants from Europe, particularly from Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Germany. Millions of people, seeking a new life, crossed the Atlantic to work on the coffee fazendas. They were no longer enslaved, but the conditions were often harsh, and the labor was grueling. This massive wave of immigration would forever change the demographic and cultural landscape of Brazil. The coffee industry survived this profound transformation. It adapted. The era of the coffee barons and their slave-powered empire gave way to a new system, but Brazil's dominance as the world's coffee producer remained unchallenged. As the 20th century dawned, the focus of coffee's story began to shift from the fields of production to the kitchens and cities of its biggest consumer, the United States of America. While Europe had introduced coffee to the West, it was America that democratized it on an unprecedented scale. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, coffee became deeply woven into the fabric of American life. It was the drink of the frontier, brewed over campfires by cowboys. It was the fuel for the factories of the Gilded Age. It was the symbol of hospitality, the first thing offered to a guest in one's home. This era saw the birth of the great American coffee brands. Names like Folgers, founded during the California Gold Rush, and Maxwell House, which gained fame after President Theodore Roosevelt supposedly declared its coffee to be good to the last drop, became household names. Marketing and branding became as important as the beans themselves. Coffee was no longer just coffee. It was a symbol of modernity, of American ingenuity, and of the good life. Advertisements portrayed coffee as the cornerstone of the family breakfast, the essential start to a productive workday, the perfect companion for a friendly chat. Companies developed new packaging technologies, like the vacuum-sealed tin can, which allowed them to keep coffee fresh on grocery store shelves for months, bringing a consistent product to every corner of the vast country. The method of consumption also changed. The percolator became a fixture in the American kitchen, its familiar gurgling sound a morning ritual for millions. Coffee was less about the nuanced ritual of the Turkish ibrik or the intellectual debate of the London Coffeehouse, and more about convenience, consistency, and a reliable dose of caffeine to power a nation on the move. The American drive for convenience reached its logical conclusion with one of the most significant innovations in coffee's history: instant coffee. The concept had been experimented with for decades, but it was perfected and commercialized in the 1930s by the Swiss company Nestlé, who created Nescafé. The process involved brewing vast quantities of coffee and then dehydrating it, either through spray drying or freeze drying, leaving behind soluble crystals or powder. All the consumer had to do was add hot water. Initially, the product struggled to find a market. Coffee purists were appalled by its taste, which lacked the depth and aroma of freshly brewed coffee. But then, a global conflict changed everything. During World War II, instant coffee became an essential part of an American soldier's rations. It was lightweight, had a long shelf life, and could be prepared anywhere with a source of hot water, from the muddy trenches of Europe to the humid jungles of the Pacific. Millions of soldiers developed a taste, or at least a tolerance for instant coffee. When they returned home, they brought the habit with them. In the post-war boom of the 1950s, a culture of convenience swept America. Housewives were marketed a vision of a modern, effortless future, filled with time-saving appliances and packaged foods. Instant coffee fit this vision perfectly. It was quick, it was easy, and it required no cleanup. For several decades, quality took a back seat to convenience, and the humble can of instant coffee crystals held a dominant place in the American kitchen. For a long time, it seemed that coffee had reached its final form as a mass-produced, bland commodity. But a quiet revolution was brewing. A generation that had grown up on instant and percolated coffee began to crave something more, something better. They were discovering that coffee, like wine, could have a complex and varied character, depending on where and how it was grown. This movement became known as the second wave of coffee. It was a rebellion against bad coffee. It championed freshly roasted, high-quality Arabica beans over the cheaper, harsher Robusta beans often used in instant and canned coffee. It introduced the American public to the language of coffee. Terms like French roast, espresso, latte, and cappuccino entered the popular lexicon. And at the heart of this revolution was a single company from Seattle. Starbucks, which started as a humble roaster of dark beans, had a vision inspired by the espresso bars of Italy. They envisioned a third place for Americans, a space between home and work where people could gather, relax, and enjoy a high-quality, handcrafted cup of coffee. Their expansion in the late 1980s and 1990s was nothing short of phenomenal. They transformed the American landscape, making the coffeehouse a ubiquitous feature of every city and suburb. They created a new culture around coffee. It was no longer just a quick caffeine fix. It was an affordable luxury, a daily ritual, an experience. You didn't just buy a coffee. You ordered a grande, non-fat, extra hot latte. The barista became a new kind of skilled artisan, and the coffeehouse became the world's new office, living room, and first date spot. The revolution that Starbucks started did not end there. It paved the way for what is now known as the third wave. If the first wave was about making coffee accessible, and the second wave was about making it better and more experiential, The third wave is about treating coffee as a true artisanal product, like fine wine or craft beer. The third wave is defined by an almost scientific and reverent approach to every step of the process. It's about single origin beans, where the coffee can be traced back to a specific farm, or even a specific plot of land on that farm. It's about understanding the terroir, the unique soil, climate, and altitude that give the beans their distinct flavor profile. It champions lighter roast profiles that preserve the delicate, fruity, and floral notes of the bean, rather than masking them with a dark, roasty flavor. It emphasizes meticulous brewing methods, from the precise timing and temperature of a pour-over to the complex science of a perfect espresso extraction. This movement has reconnected the drinker to the producer in a way that hasn't existed for centuries. It celebrates the farmer as much as the barista. It's a journey that has come full circle. From a mythical bean discovered on a remote Ethiopian mountain, coffee has traveled through empires, fueled revolutions, built industries, and become a global commodity. And now, in its most recent chapter, it has returned to being a story of place, a story of care, and a story of the simple, profound pleasure found in a perfectly crafted cup. The long, winding path of this humble bean continues to evolve, constantly being rediscovered and reinterpreted, its aroma weaving through the past, the present, and the future, a constant and comforting companion to the story of humanity itself. Our story, which began with a single shrub on an Ethiopian hillside, now encircles the planet. Today, coffee is cultivated along a fragile ribbon of land that wraps around the Earth's waist, a region known as the Bean Belt. It is this band, nestled between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, that provides the perfect mix of altitude, temperature, and rainfall to nurture the delicate coffee plant. The journey of the bean is no longer the story of one or two empires, but of more than 70 nations. From the soaring volcanic slopes of Colombia, where each cherry is picked by hand with meticulous care, to the basaltic red earth of Vietnam's Central Highlands, which has risen to become the world's powerhouse of Robusta coffee. From the ancient forests of Ethiopia, where coffee trees still grow wild as their ancestors did, to the smallholder cooperatives of Costa Rica, where farming families work together to produce some of the most sought-after specialty beans. For an estimated 25 million families around the globe, coffee is not a luxury. It is their lifeblood. It is the rhythm of the year. From the season of white blossoms that perfume the valleys with a scent like jasmine, to the harvest of the deep crimson cherries, it is the hard work under the sun, the hope for a good crop, the economic foundation for entire communities. Every sip of coffee we take is the final link in an immense and intricate global chain, a chain that connects us to these farmers thousands of miles away. And while the belt of production has widened, our understanding of the bean itself has reached an unprecedented depth. The third wave gave birth to a new generation of roasters, baristas, and scientists who approach coffee not just as a craft, but as a precise science. Today, there are professional tasters, known as Q graders, whose palates are trained to identify and score coffee quality with the accuracy of a wine sommelier. They can discern hundreds of subtle notes in a single cup, from the bergamot and floral character of an Ethiopian yirgacheffe to the chocolate and nutty notes of a Brazilian bourbon to the bright, citrusy acidity of a Colombian caturra. Producers have become alchemists, experimenting with post-harvest processing methods to unlock the flavors latent within the bean. The washed process creates a clean, bright flavor profile. The dry, or natural process, where the cherry is dried whole, imparts sweet, heavy notes of wine and fruit. And new, experimental methods, like anaerobic fermentation, where the coffee is fermented in an oxygen-free environment, are creating complex and exotic flavors once thought impossible. In laboratories, botanists study the coffee genome, breeding new varietals that not only have unique flavor profiles, but are also more resistant to disease and better able to withstand a harsher climate. The search for the perfect cup has become a scientific pursuit, a marriage of art and technology, all in service of celebrating the incredible complexity hidden inside one small seed. Yet, even as we reach these new heights of understanding and perfection, a shadow looms over this golden age. The story of coffee is now facing its most challenging chapter yet. That threat is climate change. The Arabica coffee plant, the species that produces the world's most aromatic and complex beans, is an incredibly sensitive organism. It thrives in only a very narrow band of temperature, altitude, and rainfall. As global temperatures rise, that fertile coffee belt is under threat. The very mountainsides that gave birth to the finest Arabicas are growing warmer, pushing the delicate plants further and further uphill into a future with less and less room to grow. Warmer temperatures also allow devastating pests and diseases to spread, particularly a fungus known as coffee leaf rust, which can wipe out entire plantations. Unpredictable weather patterns, from prolonged droughts to torrential downpours, are disrupting the delicate harvest cycles that farmers have depended upon for generations. The future of coffee, especially high-quality coffee, is no longer a guarantee. It depends on the innovation of scientists, the adaptation of farmers, and the choices we, the consumers, at the end of the chain, make. The story of coffee has become a microcosm of the larger challenge facing our planet. And so our long journey comes to its close. A journey that has taken us from a legend of dancing goats to the quiet cloisters of Sufi monks, through the boisterous coffee houses of London and Paris, into the heart of empires and revolutions, across stormy seas, and into new worlds, and finally, into this present moment. All of that history, all of those stories, converge in the quiet stillness of a single cup. The next time you hold a warm mug of coffee in your hands, take a moment, feel its warmth, inhale its aroma, an aroma that once intrigued monks and financed empires. Think of the incredible journey those grounds have taken to get to you. Think of Caldi the Goatherd and his simple curiosity. Think of the scholars in Constantinople debating ideas that would shape the world. Think of Gabriel de Clea sharing his meager water ration with a seedling on the Atlantic. Think of the unnamed lives that toiled in the fields, and the innovators who sought perfection in the roast. The story of coffee, in the end, is a story of connection. It connects us to the past, to distant cultures, and to millions of people across the planet today. It is a simple ritual, a quiet moment of pause in a world that never stops moving. And now, as our story ends, let the gentle rhythm of this history guide you. Let the images of distant hills and quiet oceans fill your mind. There is nothing left to do, nowhere left to go. There is only the peace of this moment as you drift gently away into a deep and restful sleep.